Well, ani nanishnabik, miigwech gijimanadu, mishomasak, nakomasak, mino manituash kabewasak, ani chimukamonik, ispanishak, ani nakina. Indigenous cause Gati Canoe in Donjiba, White Earth, Minnesota. In Donjiba, Nakomasaki, Mishomashishpaming, on Nangunk, Anamiki, Anamikiishkude. I want to say Chi Miigwech. Miigwech is thank you, Chi is big thank you to the organizers of the conference this year and for every year that I've attended. I want to give thanks to also Ana and Jesus and Villarica for the work on this and all the people on the SAAS committee, and to the faculty, staff, and students here at the university for your work on this conference. And I'm very happy about this generous invitation you extended to me. You didn't have to make me a plenary, I would have come anyway. And I want to say, and Anna's saying welcome back to Salamanca, I was here in '94 as well. I believe it was '94, it could have been '95. I was traveling with my family and the disreputable Gerald Visner at the time. We did an impromptu lecture storytelling session with a hall full of students, as I remember. And I also remember sitting with Visner and talking with Professor Coy in Professor Coy's office at that time, and he mentioning his work on Mamadé and reflecting a bit on his interest in bringing American Indian literature to Spain. Since that time, it's very pleasing to see how much people are reading American Indian literature in Spain. At that time, it seemed like it was just starting to take off. Perhaps I'm mistaken about that. So I do have good memories of being here, even though I was traveling with Visner, a man so steeped in irony. One can never know if anything he says or writes is anything but a double-edged expression of a conceptual persona of a trickster sensibility. I'd also like to acknowledge those colleagues from Spain who've supported me over the years. This is a very long intro, sorry. And who've invited me to Spain. Isabel, Nacho, Sylvia, Carmen, Carolina, Ana, Paca, Susana, Esther, Maria Jose, Maria Jesus. Some of them aren't here. And so many others. Miigwech to all of you. As you must know by now, I've grown to love Spain. And this invitation, like so many others, reinforced that love, I'd say. That said, as Bob Dylan once wrote in the song Boots of Spanish Leather, I don't know when I'll be coming back again. It depends on how I'm feeling. And so while I'm honored to be here, to be sure, I'm also somewhat intimidated. But I'd like to begin, if you don't mind, with a song. And this, you'll see that this is a multi-narrative. I hope to even get to some fiction and poetry by the end. This song that I'm going to sing, and I'm thankful for this drum that Ana and Jesus had, I didn't bring my drum this time, is a sunrise song, and it's also a moon song depending on what the words are. And before I sing this song, I also need to say that I don't speak on behalf of other Native people. I don't speak on behalf of all Native people. Too often when we as individual Native people speak to audiences, people take what we say as the singular truth, and the Native populations of people in North America, South America, Central America are so diverse, it's almost impossible for anyone to speak for all the people. I can't even speak for all the people in my family. I have a large family of 10 people, so I will start with this song. Maybe, I don't know, so maybe I should stand, huh?
Way
Let me go ahead. I've seen that happen at ceremonies too. There's a guy now walking around with an eye patch after that happened. So, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more consistently reflective than I once was. I've grown more reflective about my experience in tribal communities, my knowledge of ceremonies, and my relationship to writing and literature. My academic field of American Indian literature has changed drastically since I first entered the field back in the 1980s. And I've tried to reinforce that work by reminding people that we have to continue to work in tribal communities and keep learning from ceremonial life. I do try to follow new developments in Native literature, and I follow the work of the hottest new Native writers, but I find myself returning to the seminal works of the literature and to writers of literature that I've always read for a long time. I continue to find more in those works, in fact. That's not to say the newer, younger writers aren't doing interesting things. It's just I think the initial wave of American Indian literature still holds the kinds of things that I find to be most connected to community and some of the things of interest to me, including ceremony. And they have the most profound cultural considerations for expressing, yes, even in English, uniquely grounded knowledge of American Indian people. So from here on, toward the end, I will refer to passages of work by N. Scott Momaday and Housemaid of Dawn, Leslie Marmon's Silko's Ceremony, and Ray Youngbear's Remnants of the First Earth. In between that, I'll offer a bit of academic discourse and accounts of my own ceremonial experiences. And perhaps these are further oblique expressions relating to passages from works of each of those writers. And in part, I will also try to address a few other issues. This is part 3 in this way, narrating space and place. In narrating space and place, Peter Bodenheimer reminds us, quote, "Today historians and other humanists are acutely aware of the social and political construction of space and its unique expression as place. Space is not simply the setting for historical action, but a significant product and determinant of change. It is not a passive setting, but the medium for the development of culture." He quotes, "Space is not an empty dimension along which social groupings become structured," sociologist Anthony Giddens notes, "but it has to be considered in terms of its involvement in the contribution of systems of interaction. All spaces contain embedded stories based on what has happened there. These stories are both individual and collective, and each of them link geography, space, and history, time." For American Indians, the greater sense of space that Bodenheimer refers to in narrating space has been integral to Native knowledge. Narrative ceremonies and images marking space as place have been going on for generations before Bodenheimer's so-named spatial turn. To this point, Vine Deloria remarks, quote, the contrast between Christianity, its interpretation of history, the temporal dimension, and the American Indian tribal religions, basically spatially located, is clearly illustrated when we understand the nature of sacred mountains, sacred hills, sacred rivers, and other geographical figures sacred Indian tribes. While Deloria's claim marks clear differences of Native views against non-Native views, it's clear that Native engagement with spiritual geographies of the sacred among Native people is paramount in his mind. Yet he does not mention, or he may assume in his discussion of the spatial, of the ways Native ceremonies involve systematic construction of sacred spaces, which embody and transmit relations between space, place, time, and people, calling out to and communicating with what Ray Youngbear calls a plethora of animistic factors immersed in ethereal realities. And so the first image I have is one such sacred space. It's the interior of a thirsty dance. We are not allowed to take pictures of the dance while it's going on, but before it starts and after it's over, we can have these photographs. And as a leader of the ceremony, this is what I tell people. So this next part, part 4, Niwin, 1984, Dakota Akin, Sisseton Reservation, Indigene Beijing, healing song. A few friends invited me to the Dakota Sisseton-Wahpeton Reservation while I was a student at the University of North Dakota. They were Jake Thompson and his wife and partner Teresa Henry, a relative of mine from the Turtle Mountain Chippewa tribe of North Dakota. The morning after we all took a sweat lodge ceremony, Teresa and I went out to gather sage from the hills beyond Jake's sister's res house, where we all stayed while in Sisseton. While gathering and looking for sage, Teresa and I crested one of the hills of the land there. Not long after we got to the top of the hill, we heard singing coming down from below, coming from the area we had been in ceremony the night before. With the singing, space and place transformed, time shifted. Previously still clouds above suddenly shifted from that still state, churning and rolling, rapidly billowing and lowering lower, then still lower until 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 eagles emerged from the clouds, turning, circling just above. Teresa and I, as the song carried up the hill, looked at each other. She had been taking photographs while walking, but had left her camera on a stone near where we picked sage. As the eagles came into view, Teresa said, "Get the camera, get the camera." With the camera in hand, she snapped pictures of the eagles descending, circling from the roll of the cloud and the carry of the song. Then the singing stopped. The eagles rose again, merged into the clouds, and the clouds stopped, went still again, as if nothing had happened. We had no idea how much time had passed in that cast of voice and that sound of song and that circling of eagles. And later, we found the photographs that never developed. They came out black, imageless. From that experience and reflection upon what happened then and from other experiences, I learned that ceremony compresses, expands time and space, transforms the ordinary elements of sight, sound, all sense from the habituated regimes of signs into an immersive relation with Young Bear's plethora of animistic factors. That, in that ceremonial immersion, in turn produces a non-self, a self not known, yet not other, except through a transcendental ceremonial empiricism, that may never be replicated or produced in the same way in the future or any other time. The song Teresa and I heard was part of a ceremony, being held down the hill where we saw the eagles emerge. I know because I asked the man who led the sweat the night before, the same man who sang the songs as the eagles came down. The man who sang that song is part of a healing ceremony for one of the women who came to Sisseton for help. I asked him about the eagles coming in as he sang. He said, yes, they come all the time. They are helpers. He also said that as he was singing, that snakes emerged from the rocks in the sweat lodge as he was singing for that healing ceremony. Part 5, Nanan, 1985, outside Grand Forks, North Dakota. When I was a graduate student at the University of North Dakota, the school there provided unique experiences for students. The university was housed in Indian country, accessible to tribes in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Minnesota. About 300 native students from different tribes attended the university there, out of a total student population of about 11,000 students. Further, given the location of the university and the University of North Dakota American Indian Studies program's commitment to American Indian students and community, the university would invite a wide range of tribal intellectuals, traditional knowledge keepers, and spiritual leaders to campus to connect with and support students. So during the time that I was a graduate student at UND, spiritual leaders and traditional knowledge holders came to campus to share and interact with students. That was and is as it should be. The University of North Dakota and practically all other universities and colleges are on land in what is still, by treaty, Indian country, or once was historically land held by tribal people. It's interesting to note here, as an aside, that we find now this trend among public universities and institutions in that they've turned to adopting land acknowledgement statements to address the institutional presence on land once held and inhabited by American Indian people. At Michigan State University, where I teach, for example, the university has adopted the following statement, and it's, quote, intended to be read at the beginning of formal events or published in printed material. The statement reads, We collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1890 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic indigenous communities in Michigan, for indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and indigenous peoples. I met with some administrators a little bit ago, and I told them that statement's nice, but when are you going to give the land back? Or some reparations. They looked at me thinking, well, there's not much we can do. Many other institutions have followed this land acknowledgement model as well, including Harvard, NYU, Stanford, Northwestern, Syracuse, many others. But again, there's still that cost of history, the loss of land that Native people continue to contend with. At the University of North Dakota, professors and administrators, at the time I was back in the story at UND, found places near campus for students to participate in traditional ceremonies while they were attending school. For example, the American Indian Studies program at UND made arrangements for us to create ceremonial space just north of town, in a small wooded place near a shallow river adjacent to a buffalo pasture. And this pasture was managed by a local farmer. There we constructed a sweat lodge. Many of the spiritual leaders who came to campus led ceremonies for students and faculties at that sweat lodge site. And so I had opportunities to participate in those ceremonies with Dakota, Lakota, Assiniboine, and Anishinaabe spiritual leaders as they offered to lead sweats and share their ways of doing ceremonies. This was truly a unique educational experience and educational way that UND had developed. One of these times, a Lakota leader, Gary Holy Bull, led one of the sweat ceremonies. Holy Bull was an imposing figure, large in life and perhaps larger in spirit. At one point, he referred to himself as an intercessor for Lakota sun dances. On the day of our sweat, with Holy Bull, I arrived early to help out. I found out there were to be two ceremonies that day, a woman's sweat followed by a men's lodge. While waiting for the stones to heat, while standing near cars parked next to the gate leading to the barbed wire fenced buffalo pasture on land next to the lodge site, I offered an offhanded remark to one of the Lakota men who traveled with Holy Bull to Grand Forks. I said, "I hope those buffalo don't come through here," as I nodded at the gate. The Lakota relative smiled, didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a moment and smiled. "After all," he said, "the buffalo are far off from us. You could see them in the next pasture like a quarter of a mile away, well off in the distance of that large pasture." Later, the first sweat ceremony just started. The women were all already inside. The hot stones for heating the lodge had already passed through the sweat door. The doorkeeper closed the door, and the women began an opening song for the ceremony as they sang. Holy Bull walked up to the lodge, kneeled just to the right of the door, wrapped his arms along the sides of the lodge, embracing the outside of the lodge frame. He sang along with the women inside. Someone called out, pointing to the pasture beside us. En masse, in a group, the buffalo began running toward us, stopping here and there, jumping in the air, kicking up their hooves, bucking and dancing in the pasture beside us as Holy Bull and the women sang. Inside the fence, we looked at each other as we all witnessed the dancing buffalo herd. We said little, though one of the men who came with Holy Bull jokingly asked, "Is this a sign?" No more was said. Even as a few of the buffalo came even close enough to hold their noses up against the gate. Some went to the fence near where our cars were parked. The buffalo sniffed the air around us, breathing in the cars, people, the smell on our side of the fence. Most of the buffalo continued running, prancing, dancing. We just watched and waited to see what might happen next. Then the song ended. the buffalo stopped dancing, slowed to a walk, to eventually drift away from us, away from the fence, seemingly to melt back slowly to the more distant spaces of the pasture. To be sure, Bodenheimer's arguments about narrative space and place must not be reduced to short passages of his work. For example, he goes on to claim later in his work, quote, in view of a reference to Heidegger, we have no other way to experience reality than through our narratives. It is a natural human impulse. As a result, we live in an endlessly storied world, end quote. Fair enough. I will argue later, though, that ceremony offers another non-narrative way, perhaps, depending on how broadly you define narrative, of considering reality, of making reality. But Bodenheimer pushes forward with the following note, quote, in this storied world, most of the narratives we construct focus not on space, an abstract geometrical concept, but rather on the particular expression of geographical space. In place, excuse me. And he writes further, the concept of place appeals to humanists who see it as a carrier of culture, which implies that one class or group controls it. Instead, places are particularized, inclusive. They are organized worlds of meaning, characterized by experience, emotion, and memory. A place, like a ceremony, exists in the past, present, and future time. Deloria argues in the context of this existence of place that places involve relationships to the sacred and thus hold us to a moral responsibility. He writes, quote, by recognizing the various aspects of sacredness of lands as we have described, we place ourselves in a realistic context in which the individual and the group can cultivate and enhance the sacred experience. Recognizing the sacredness of lands on which previous generations have lived and died is the foundation of all other sentiment. Nishwaswe, remediating space and place, the Anthropocene, ambiguous anxiety of place and time and space. Deloria's call for developing a moral sense of place foreshadows more recent trending interest in this current age or epoch of what some people call the Anthropocene. Talk abounds these days in academic spaces and discourse places, in texts of anxious academic constructions of the Anthropocene. For example, in Effective Eco-Criticism, Emotion, Embodiment, and Environment, a collection of essays, editors Jennifer Ladino and Kyle Bladow offer this. Our collection draws attention to the preponderance of new, often bad affects emerging of being defined in the Anthropocene, including despair, resignation, climate grief, and solastalgia, as well as familiar feelings like disappointment and anxiety. Ladino and Bladow go on to state, environmentalists and other activists, especially in the United States, have long been derided or dismissed for encouraging asceticism, preaching about simplicity, and delivering jeremiads about the end of the world. So along with these affective turns associated with the Anthropocene, grief, anxiety, and so on, we also get a sense from Ladino and Bladow's introduction of refusal on the part of people to listen, to take into account, to validate certain views of what might be happening in our world in the so-called Anthropocene. But if the Anthropocene is a trending matter of discourse and has risen and fallen so heavily to earth with the weighty atmospheric effects of the litany of concerns they cite, then we might ask, what sort of preconcepts produced this fearsome anthroposcopic construction? And what sort of preconceptual personae resides there in the preconceptual nature of the Anthropocene? As the new conceptual inhabitant of the Anthropocene emerges from the preconceptual scene to become again the creator of the site subject of such discourse. In his article, Politics in, but not of the Anthropocene, John Meyer foregrounds discussion of the Anthropocene as political space. He writes, this politics must begin by recognizing that the earth is simultaneously the familiar place we inhabit and alterity, posing us as an alien other. is apt, he writes. That we are home but never can be fully at home captures the central insight of contemporary talk of the Anthropocene. Meyer goes on to formulate ways for digging into the politics of the Anthropocene. Therein he offers ambiguities that are important to addressing questions of this term that people are using so often today. And he offers ambiguities as central to the discussion, but it indicates initially at least that he's still not convinced about human geophysical agency, institutional policy, and political action as integral to the very concept of the Anthropocene as a newly formed idea. In the end, he is clearly assigning, though, the need to view the Anthropocene as a serious conceptual site for a human pursuit of justice. So alongside an affective engagement reaction with the Anthropocene lies a sense that the Anthropocene stands as a site of historical trauma, requiring some kind of political and or social justice. The irony from the native view, of course, is that native people, indigenous populations, have held names for inhabited places and interacted rather efficiently with places inside the site of the newly named Anthropocene. For as long as Westerners have formed the stratified geological names for those eras and epochs that preceded the turn to the Anthropocene, as some new trending discourse intervention in the naming of some preconceptualized epoch of time and space for all of humanity and all of what has been termed nature and culture. More plainly, native people had their own ways of understanding the world and their place in it, and they developed means for maintaining such place and the myriad relationships entailed in their relationship to place. We had ceremonies, stories, and instructions for living in this world. In 1984, I met Francis Cree, a spiritual leader at the White Earth Land Recovery Movement in White Earth, where my family's from. My family's from a little village there in Pine Point, Minnesota, in the sort of the southwest corner of the White Earth Reservation. Both my parents were raised there. My grandmother was the first American Indian school teacher in the state of Minnesota. My grandfather was a tribal manager of the White Earth tribe for a while. And I met Francis Cree there at a land recovery meeting. Some activists and I would go home on the weekends from the University of North Dakota, and some other activists recruited me to work with him on a land recovery project. We had found that of our reservation of 860,000 acres, only 5% of it was owned by Native people. And so we started investigating why this had happened. We found in our investigation that there were numerous ways the state, counties, timber companies, people who were operating stores on the reservation had concocted to steal native land. One of the ways is our land was not supposed to be taxed. The county taxed the land and then took it through tax probate court. Another way is that they would get native children, youths, 14, 15, to sign documents that they didn't know they were signing away their land. They would bring in trucks from bigger towns nearby, and bring kegs of alcohol, get people to sign away their land while they were drinking. There were other ways as well. But what we found is a lot of it had to do with the timber interest that were determining the federal government policy. At the time that we were first given allotments at the White Earth Reservation, no one could sell their land. And then the federal government passed a law which said that mixed bloods who are competent can sell their land. So suddenly on our tribal enrollment, 600 people who were full bloods on one enrollment in 1911 became mixed bloods in 1912 so that they would be able to sell their land. And so there are all these ways, and just in our short time of research, I mean, we must have been at it for less than a year, and we were organizing protests throughout Minnesota, doing walks through towns and cities, all the way from White Earth to Minneapolis. In that time, we've uncovered 200,000 acres that we could pinpoint has been taken illegally. When we uncovered this 200,000 acre land loss, illegal taking of land on White Earth, the federal government stepped in, and they brought senators to our reservation, and they had hearings. And at the hearings, we told them we wanted the land back. The more radical among us, my friend Dale Hanks, who's passed on, a great wood carver and artist, said that, no, what we need to do is we need to get our land back, and we need to ask the government to move all non-native, non-white earth people off the reservation. That was the most radical position held. Others were saying, well, we can let these people stay, but we have to be compensated for all the time that they had use of our land over the years that they've been living here. And others said, let's just take some kind of payment. I was one day sitting having a cup of coffee watching C-SPAN, and they had a hearing on the white earth land recovery. And I got up to go to the bathroom. When I came back, the senators had already passed a bill in which they turned our land over. They sold our land for $20 million, all this land. We still hadn't uncovered all of it. And at the same time, they gave us a loan of $6 million to supplement that $20 million payment. It was an incredible, quick thing, but we didn't give up. Winona LaDuke, I was working with at the time, also suggested we file individual lawsuits as people who are individual allottees of that land. So she and I and a few other people filed a lawsuit against the federal government of the United States. I might not be able to get back in the country after this, I'm sorry, back to the U.S. So we'll see, I'm not sure, but in any case. So we filed a lawsuit saying we were allottees and we were inheritants to this land, and it turns out we lost that lawsuit as well, and the tribe took the money. But in any case, this is where I met Francis Cree, and he was the person who was sort of the spiritual mentor for me as I was learning all their ceremonies. After that land recovery meeting, he invited me up to his place in North Dakota in Turtle Mountain, the land of Louise Erdrich and her family, as you know. And I went up there to take a sweat with him, and he did a naming ceremony with me. And then afterward, I went back to the university, and the following summer, he invited me to the Thirsty Dance in Turtle Mountain. And Francis is a unique historical figure in many ways. He was a tribal chairman at Turtle Mountain, and he also is in pictures with John F. Kennedy as there was a contingent of natives who had gone to Washington to express their concerns about some issues related to Native people in the 1960s. But he was also a spiritual leader. The ceremony that he was given was passed on to him from a man named Manning Eagleset from the 1860s on, and he in turn passed it on to a few of us at a dance in 1994. I had gone up there to dance for the 9th year, and he took me aside and he said, my brother and I want to talk to you. He took me into the lodge and he said, I want to give you this dance. And I want you to take it back to Michigan because people need it. I, of course, had no real investment in wanting to do something like that, but he felt that if I was somebody that could do that, perhaps I would. And so after that, I went with him and did the dance and continued to do that. And we've done this dance now for 30 years, 20 years in Michigan. It's a very difficult ceremony. We spend about a week out at the camp, a lot more time than that preparing. We start a cycle of singings at the winter solstice in December, and then 2 months later we do a second singing cycle, and then 2 months later we do another singing cycle, and then in June at the summer solstice, the night before summer solstice, we do an all-night singing, and the next day we start the dance. Prior to starting the dance, we have to construct a lodge made out of poplar trees, and in this lodge we stand up a center pole, and then we put 13 poles around that lodge, and from those 13 poles we run rafters as a center pole, and we make a door to the south, and we create little stalls, waist-high little rails inside of the lodge, and we have an altar to the north side away from the southern door, and there's a men's side for dancers and a women's side. After we get the lodge constructed, people who have pledged to dance will come in and they will fast without food or water for as long as they've pledged. Most people pledge to fast for 3.5 to 4 days. And during that time they just dance, they stay in the arbor unless they have to go out to relieve themselves. And singers sing the songs and people dance. And this is what I've been doing while I've been trying to write books and also trying to keep up with my work in the native ceremonies. And in thinking about that, after I became involved with the thirst dance, Francis invited me to be part of a group called the Native Youth and Elder Circle. And this was a unique group in which every year they would gather together, ceremonial leaders, elders, people, and youth, to a central fire at a chosen reservation. And what they would do is they would set up an arbor similar to the Sundance Arbor I described, have a fire, and all these people from the United States, North America, Central America, Canada, would come and share what they called their original instructions. And then at this fire, you'd get up first thing in the morning and people would start talking. And they would tell about what they knew. We had Onondaga people, we had Mayan people, we had native people from Montana, some pretty well-known people, Orin Lyons, Joe Medicine Horse, were all there, and they were sharing, and they were saying the things that people are saying about the Anthropocene now, way back then, 20 years ago. We had an Inuit elder saying back then that the water was starting to pour off the glaciers, and he was raising concern about that. I stood and I would listen and I tried to hear everything the elders said, and sometimes I would lose the thread of what they were saying. But when I did, I would go ask questions. One time I was watching, and it was interesting how each person did things differently. The Pueblo people would offer corn pollen. And then somebody like, say, from Six Nations would offer tobacco. One day I was listening, and I was listening to this Onondaga young man talk, and he talked for, must have been a good hour at that fire, speaking to the fire, offering tobacco. And I didn't know what he was saying. Afterwards, I said, that must have been a pretty long prayer you were saying. He said, no, we don't pray. He said, we just give thanks. And so he was just continually giving thanks for that full time that he was speaking. Didn't have a concept of prayer as we might think about it. Likewise, I saw a Seneca man, same thing, he prayed or seemed to pray for a long time. And he talked about what he was saying when I asked him, and he said, I was thinking as I was imagining I was walking up a hill, and everything I saw walking up that hill is what I would speak to when I offered that tobacco to the fire. And so this thirsty dance has brought me to the elder circle, and that elder circle continues, but it runs kind of contrary to concepts of the Anthropocene as well. And in some sense, the trending turn to the academic scenes of Anthropocenic academic discourse offers an inscribed longing for remediation through social justice, for the long-term violence humans perpetrated against nature, the environment, and a variety of human and animal subjects as they, the Anthropocenists, became cut off from the best of nature, severed from a pure existence and environment, and denied deeper relationships to space and places, uncompromised by unjust human interventions. In that regard, you might say, the Anthropocene signals but another intervention, though of interpreted type by Westerners, indicative of reformulated Western denial of not just destruction of habitats of place and ecologies of space, but of violence against inhabitants of place and the plethora of living elemental factors enlivening space. And in this denial, destruction, anxiety, there has been, of course, encroachment upon places sacred to people and a historical refusal to acknowledge understanding by native people that native people had about better ways to consider human relations to place and space. But now that the scientific data is pouring in, as the glaciers pour away perhaps, it's too late to consider the ways native might have offered some understanding of such earth changes. As with environmentalists Blado and Ladino, as they mentioned, native people, indigenous people worldwide have been dismissed and much worse, been subjected to spiritual, epistemological, cultural, and physical bodily violence. Though they too have had much to say about space, place, and ecology, though perhaps not in the same way or with the same terms environmentalists and ecologists might employ in expressing either effective political or material concerns about the larger spaces and smaller local places modern humans have made messes of. Perhaps the academic scientific Anthropocene in its dearthly nominal constructions engenders loss of storied relations, indicates lack of ceremonial expressions of the sacred, in which human becomes not human, not Anthropocene to experience a transcendental empiricism of a non-self as a deinstitutionalized, deprogrammed, discourse-free actor, open to an outside that will remain incomprehensible, reminding participants of an ongoing exchange from life to life. I don't know how much time we have. Are we getting close? So here's a few views of the Thirsty Dance Arbor. This is the outside again before and after the ceremony. We cover the whole thing that I mentioned before, and so people are inside dancing that whole time of 4 days. And if you're a native lit student, that's the interior, the middle tree. All those cloths are offering and pledges that people have brought, signifying what their prayers would be. Some people just ask for help with health issues, some people for relatives, some people for their own struggles. So I won't speak too long about this part. There's just a few quotes here I want to give. But if you're looking for some ceremonial elements in Native literature, we can go back to Housemaid of Dawn, Ceremony by Leslie Silko. And I also want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about Ray Youngbear's work. And one of the things that's interesting about Housemaid of Dawn is that prior to this opening part of the prologue, we find the word prologue actually above this particular passage, the first paragraph of actual text. And so in some ways, Mamade is producing there this Western convention of a literary prologue, and then right away turns that back by using this word dapola, which is a Gemes Pueblo term for the beginning of a story. And so in that way, he's entering a different kind of oral tradition construction, and more, as we move forward, he says there was a housemaid of dawn. And housemaid of dawn refers, of course, to the Navajo night chant, and then we are entering into prayer. We are entering into the ceremonial moments of the prologue. And then after that, we get these accretions of images and elements, what I would call crystalline fractals of landscape that starts to give us a sense of place. And I call them crystalline fractals because they come to us in fragments, but they are later reintroduced in other ways later in the story through offerings, for example, of a character, an offering of pollen, through the land in the colors and the clay and sand. You'll see that later. So one of the ways you can think about ceremony is how native writers have written about it. And then the next part of this goes right to the character Abel running along this road in the mountains. Now when readers first encounter this, they don't know what he's doing. All we know is he's running. We don't know why he's running. We don't know what he's doing. He's running on this road. This road, too, is like a precursor, a preview into the road that his grandfather will drive down to pick him up. What we find is also here that the land that he's running against is also given to us in these little fractals and images. And so, but what we do find out is that his arms and shoulders have been marked with burnt wood and ashes. So he's been painted with ashes or covered with ashes as he's running, and we know then he's in some kind of a ceremony. He is running in ceremony. And further, the ashes and burnt wood that's covering him, as we go further back in the novel, just before he goes back on his run, were taken out of his grandfather's wood stove after his grandfather died. And so he rubbed the ashes from his grandfather's wood stove, and he started on this ceremonial run called the Run for the Dead after his grandfather died. So this little ceremonial moment in the beginning serves as the frame for the novel. At the same time, it shows a character immersed in a kind of state in where he seems to be running, but against the backdrop of this immense landscape, he seems to be standing still as well. And he seems to be little and alone. But one of the most profound things I want to share with you, I might not be able to get to ceremony, is a passage later in the work, just before the old man dies, just before Abel goes out on his run. The old man has this last memory, sort of. and he's thinking about his grandsons. And he says, they must learn the whole contour of the Black Mesa. They must know it as they knew the shape of their hands, always and by heart. The sun rose up on the Black Mesa at a different place each day. It began there at a point on Central Slope, standing still for the solstice, and ranged all along the day southward across the rise and fall of the long plateau, drawing closer by the measure of morning and moons to the lee and back again. They must know the long journey of the sun on the Black Mesa, how it rode on the seasons, the years, and they must live according to the sun appearing, for then they could reckon where they were, where all things were in time. And Mamadei comes up with, I think, one of the more profound terms in Native literature, if I can find it. He says this is the meaning of the great organic calendar itself. He wanted his grandsons to know the meaning of this great organic calendar. This is not a term that we usually hear or even connect with sometimes, but it's an insightful term, and again, talks about this relation to land and place in a way in which every time a child sees this old man sees this, he knows what ceremony at what time of year is taking place just by the way the sun moves on the mesa. So the last thing I want to leave you with, if I can, I think I have just enough time. Take a look at the ceremony is a book called Ceremony, but there is inside of the book a ceremony that you can actually see the character going through. But I wanted to share with you what I thought was one of the most interesting things I've seen in Native literature in the past 15, 20 years by my favorite Native poet, Ray Youngbear. He says, my maternal grandmother used to say it was crucial that we have a place of our own. Listening intently, I learned that our lives were dependent upon a plethora of animistic factors immersed in ethereal realities. That's ceremony in a nutshell as well. She instructed that the very ground on which we all stood, Grandmother Earth, was the embodiment of a supernatural being. This is an incredible formulation, to think of the earth as a supernatural being. She was all of nature, this grandmother. She was the foundation for rivers, lakes, fields, and forests. She provided homes and sustenance for insects, birds, reptiles. She held everything together, including the stars, sun, and the moon. And then he leaves us with this. Our sole obligation, my grandmother instructed, and having been created in the first place by the Holy Grandfather, is to maintain the principal religion of the Earth Lodge clans. It was agreed eons and eons ago that if these ceremonies were not performed, the world would no longer be held together. The elements of wind and ice would whirl together and splinter us apart. Our forgetfulness, in other words, would become part of a chain of natural and man-made catastrophes, flag wars and ecological suffocation, leading to the end of the earth, and the people who so connivingly and viciously sought to make us forget ourselves. By subjugating us, the Euro-Americans would be the root cause. It's a pretty damning political statement, I'd say, by Youngbear, but very much in with the beliefs that he has. I'm just going to, do I have like a couple more minutes?
Yeah.
All right. And so I'd just like to end you with a sort of my own ceremonial immersion piece. It's out of a story I did. It's just a short page or so. And I might even have time to sing a song and for Marjorie recite a short poem as well. This is from a prayer of a character in my book that I'm working on. It's been published in a book called Inside Bob Seger's House, Michigan Writers. And it's called Good Spoken's Prayer. He's inside a ceremonial lodge in a sweat lodge. He's taking the sweat lodge bucket from his guy next to him named Luke, and he said, when Luke was out of steam, he passed the bucket to me. The stone grandfathers were almost cold. The sweat ran real then. I was no longer observing. I felt spirits watching, observing me. I prayed from the small flame of a fractured indigenous heart. I prayed for the planets, the magnetic flow and biting of elder sun, the material world, the gaseous race and shimmers, the dense matter people, the inhabitants of mists above, the beings of flight, their blue wings, their morning calls from hidden limbs, or brief passages through the sky. I honored the keepers of vegetal villages, the makers of Heal-All and Pearly Everlasting, the tobacco dwellers, the red willow elders, the strawberry grandmothers, the weeping sisters of squash, corn, and bean, the brothers and great uncles of syllabary shapes in oak, maple, and elm. I gave thanks for the insect transformation, for communities of bug peoples. I talked of the light-struck Mamegwase. I remembered the little people, the point makers, Greasy Man, Little Harry and Ninny. I prayed for the hunted as providers and the wisdom behind traps and survival weapons. I saw into the center of the heart flame and watched part of it licking back into smoke. I didn't know where words came from. I remembered saying the stars' names were wrong, that the wide star roads held the names of all of us and all who came before. I spoke of the dead senses of humans, of the atrophied regions of brain and vision, of the lost genes and the replication of dead moments of lust and manufactured desires. I was not angry but sorrowful. I sang the song of my dead father, recalling him barely breathing in the hospital, where granddaughters sang in fours, 3 verses about going home. I asked for forgiveness for the anger, for the shame that leads us to worthlessness. I called on memories of diviners I'd never known. I resequenced dream transmissions, talked of vibration penetrating us as receivers, and of the resonance of voices between doorways and dark nights from which we never returned. I told stories of self-betrayal, stunned the stone-hissing quiet with some tears I'd been carrying for so long. I forgot where it was I should have left them. I was drawing closer to this sorrow. I felt the spirit on my tongue walking out with my voice, ready to deliver just a simple word of love. And this one's for Margie. Just one quick, sorry, take 5 minutes. This is called Odom Dream Song, wrote for my father. Old man, I will guide your silver canoe to the center of the water, where the loon father carries children on his back. If I am quiet, I will arrive as a call from another shore, to draw close enough to see the fantastic eyes seeing me drifting alone. And I'll close with a quick song.
One song.
Yeah, just one song.
Okay.
Don't worry. Miigwech keje manendo, Again, I just want to give thanks. Miigwech, thanks.